Hi, I'm Joseph Komorowski, and today we'll do another little mini lecture on Hurley's Introduction to Logic, 13th edition. We're in Chapter 2, Language, Meaning and Definition. More specifically, we're in Section 2.5, Criteria for Lexical Definitions. Now, I use this text as a professor when I teach logic at Mount San Antonio College, or Mount SAC, or critical thinking at Cal State San Marcos. I use the same text for both classes, just different chapters. So anyways, here we are in the last section of Chapter 2. And if you happen to be in another part of the world not taking any one of these classes, well, I hope you enjoy as well. So here we go. So Hurley asks us a few questions. Always, in the beginning of each section, how logical are you? And then he goes on to unpack what he means, with regards to that question. But let me just start by reading. Suppose you were to look in a dictionary and find these definitions. Beaver, a furry animal. Oligarchy, a terrible form of government. Art, whatever is produced by an artist. Do you think these definitions are appropriate in a dictionary? Why or why not? And he goes on to tell you, basically there are 8 criteria for a definition, that if a definition fails one of these criteria, it doesn't make it into a dictionary. So it has to have all 8. And we'll go through these and I'll give you a few examples in Hurley's text. Rule 1. So you can access in a Mind Tap class or in a book that you have, but either way, Rule 1. A definition, like any other form of expression, should be grammatically correct. Examples of definitions that are grammatically incorrect are as follows. Vacation is when you don't have to go to work or school. Furious means if you're angry at someone. Cardiac is like something to do with the heart. Now, when I read these 3 to you, when I say is when, means if you're, is like, that's pretty sloppy language. Is like sounds like Valley Girl talk, or like we're in here in Southern California. So what Hurley will go on to say as far as this criteria is each term that we're describing has to be quoted. And also the grammar has to be correct. So let me read you another 3 examples. Vacation means a period during which activity is suspended from work or school. Doesn't that sound more precise? Furious means a condition of being very angry, or cardiac means pertaining to, situated near, or acting on the heart. Those would be correct grammar. So if you're listening to me and not following along the book, on the second example, if you're angry at someone, your has an apostrophe in it. So in a dictionary, you don't want to have apostrophes. You want to have the words separated out. That'd be another grammatical problem. So Rule 1, proper grammar. Rule 2, you have to convey the essential meaning of the word being defined. It gives you the example of a human being a featherless biped. That's a really short definition. A featherless biped. I've never really considered myself featherless, but okay, we'll roll with that, right? Well, he goes on to tell you what's missing from there, the essential meaning of the word human, is capacity to reason, use language. I might even throw, emotional capacity. You might just say, if we say a featherless biped, there's something lacking, there's something missing, there's something essential missing from the word human, right, being defined. And you'd say, therefore, it doesn't convey the essential meaning, therefore, it lacks that criteria of Rule 2, therefore, it doesn't make it in as a definition if you say human's a featherless biped. You have to broaden the scope and say, hey, capacity to reason, use language, may be a featherless biped, so that you don't lose any essential meaning. Rule 3, lexical definition should neither be too broad nor too narrow. So just a brief definition or a brief understanding of this. If something's too broad, it means it includes too much. And you want to decrease that broadness and you want to include just a little less. If something's too narrow, it doesn't include enough. You want to increase that so that it includes a little bit more, okay? So either one of those, if it's too broad or too narrow, it violates the lexical rule number 3, and it doesn't make it in as a definition. So he gives you an example. He says, Let me see. Let me read to you. If a definition is too broad, the definins includes too much. Again, review definins is the word or words doing the defining of the definendum, which is the word to be defined. So if, for example, bird were defined as any warm-blooded animal having wings, the definition would be too broad because it would include bats, and bats are not birds. Again, too broad means it includes too much, so you want to strip down a little bit more to where you strip off bats, and then you have a better definition that's not as broad. And then he uses the same example. He says, if, on the other hand, bird were defined as any warm-blooded, feathered animal that can fly, the definition would be too narrow because it would exclude ostriches and penguins that cannot fly. So again, it's too narrow. You need to include a little bit more, like ostriches and penguins, because, hey man, they can't fly, but they're still birds. So those are just two examples. And again, you can do the reading, and I always expect you to have done the reading before you get here, because this is just a supplemental mini lecture that I'm giving you. But okay, so rule 3, can't be too broad, can't be too narrow. Rule 4, has to avoid circularity. So the definition is circular when the definendum is defined in terms of itself or virtually in terms of itself. And this will just be obvious when I give you a few examples. Science means the activity engaged in by scientists. So if you're looking, you can see that it forms a circle because it's not clear to me what science is when you point me to scientists, which is another word virtually the same as science. So it seems like it's going in a circle. Or scientist means anyone who engages in science. Well, that's great. That's not any more clear to me. And again, it seems circular. Why? Because this word is virtually in terms of that word. They're very similar, too similar. How do you break this circle? Well, you break it by giving me independent language other than the word you're asking to be defined. So independent language, we'll get to that in a second. Let me give you another example. Supperific means supperiferous. Really? I mean, this word is almost exactly like this, just in a different way. What about jeweler's rogue means a rogue used by a jeweler? Well, that is awesome. Again, it is not clear to me at all because it's circular. I'm using the exact same words using to define the words. So how do I break the circle? Now back to what I was going to tell you about before. Independent language. What terms can I use that are independent of this? Supperific means tending to cause sleep. That's independent language used to describe supperific. So that breaks the circle that we saw above, right? So I'm avoiding circularity, right? What about jeweler's rogue? Jeweler's rogue means a very fine polishing compound. Again, I'm breaking the circle that we saw above because I'm not using the same language or virtually the same language used to describe what I'm trying to define. I'm using independent language, very fine polishing compound. So again, this is rule 4. You want to avoid circularity. That's one of the criteria, so that a definition makes it into a dictionary. Okay. Rule 5, lexical definition should avoid being negative when it could be affirmative. So this is real simple. It gives you a couple examples. Concord means harmony versus concord means the absence of discord. So you might say, this is the affirmative, which would be good. The second one is in the negative. Why? Absence of discord. So don't think about this too much. It should be pretty obvious if it uses the word no or not or something that's in the negative. I'll give you a couple examples before we're done with this little mini lecture here. Then he goes on to give you a couple counters to this. He says, look, there are some words that are just intrinsically negative. There's no way else to define them. He gives you the example bald, meaning lacking hair. And this reminds me, literally, this last week on Facebook, my friend posted something about bald eagles. I forget what it was about, right? Well, my other friend who is bald, he goes, why do they got to call them bald eagles? And I just started laughing so hard because I thought about, Why do they call them bald eagles? I mean, they got feathers. They're not literally bald. But anyways, my bald friend, he took offense to that. I thought it was fun. But anyways, back to this. Bald means lacking hair. Means lacking hair. There's really no else to describe bald other than lacking hair. Well, lacking hair seems to be in the negative. Well, he's trying to say that would be an exception to the rule, right? So that would seem to not violate the lexical rule, because there's no real other way to define baldness other than something negative or lacking hair. Darkness means the absence of light. Again, absence seems to be describing darkness in the negative, but he says there's really no other way to do it. So these would be two examples, and there's more that you can think of. But otherwise, here's the bottom line. If you have a choice, when you can describe or define something in the affirmative versus the negative, you take the affirmative route, and then you're not violating this lexical rule, okay? Or this criteria. Rule 6. A lexical definition should avoid figurative, obscure, vague, or ambiguous language. Kind of already covered vague and ambiguous in sections 2.1, 2.2. So this is just review, but there's two more terms here coming in at you. Figurative involves metaphors or tends to paint a picture instead of exposing the essential meaning of a term. I'll give you one example. He gives you two, but I'll just illustrate one. Camel means a ship of the desert. Really? When I think of camel, I'm not thinking about a ship of the desert. In fact, when you define it like that, I'm thinking somebody took a bong rip of marijuana and started talking. So it's not clear to me when you define ship of the desert that I'm talking about camel. I'm thinking about an animal, some other accurate, more specific description of an animal. So again, ship of the desert's figurative. It paints a picture. It's lacking the essential meaning, okay? And you want to avoid doing that. Obscure. The meaning is hidden as a result of defective or inappropriate language. Overly technical language, okay? That's one of the standouts of being obscure. So bunny means a mammalian of the family Leporidae of the order of Lagomorpha, whose young are born furless and blind. Really? That is really technical. I suppose I could get that if I was a science major in graduate work, getting that specific, but I'm not. I just want to know, what's a bunny mean? And bunny means rabbit, so there's another word of describing it that makes you think of an animal, okay? Having long ears, can hop, things like that. Has long teeth, 2 front teeth, eats carrots, things like that. But the first example gave you overly technical language, and it was obscuring the actual meaning of the definition, so you want to avoid that. Why is this practical for some of you? Well, some of you are writing papers, and your professors or teachers have said, hey, too technical, simplify it. When they're doing that, they're really telling you your paper might be a little obscure, or that section of your paper. Now, some of you like using overly technical language. I get it, so do I, especially since I'm an analytic philosopher. But some professors and teachers like very concise, simplified language. And the reason they do is because they want to make sure that you understand what you're talking about when you're defining something or describing something. And if it's overly technical, they might say, maybe you don't even understand that yourself. Let's keep it simple, okay? Bottom line. He gives you an example of vague. And I like the way he defines it here. And this, again, is on page 120, if you're following along in the text. That means lacks precision, or if the meaning's blurred. Meaning there's no set boundary of what you mean when you talk about this. It's blurred. I gave you an example, later in an earlier lecture. Notorious words that are vague are poor, rich, cold. What do you mean by poor? When you use that word, it's kind of vague. And somebody else has to come along and say, oh, I mean poor, meaning less than $5,000 a year or something like that. You got to give me more detail. So anyways, you can look at the examples. And ambiguous lends itself to more than one distinct interpretation. Again, this would be if it has two possible meanings or more, and it's ambiguous because it could mean two different meanings, but I'm not sure which one you want me to conclude with. Is it this meaning or is it that meaning? It's ambiguous. There's two different interpretations. You got to make it clear to me which one. So he gives the example of a triangle there. And you can look at these examples in Hurley's text of vague and ambiguous. I've already reviewed that in a previous lecture. So we'll go on. But the bottom line with this is there's 4 different examples of Rule 6. Okay? Figurative, obscure, vague, or ambiguous. And you want to avoid any one of those instances if you want a definition to be included in a dictionary. Rule 7, a lexical definition should avoid effective terminology. What's effective? Any kind of word usage that plays on the emotions of the reader or listener. So again, this is critical because in critical thinking and logic, we want to avoid using emotive language. We want to use more cognitive, more fact-based language so that we are reaching the rational component of somebody's mind and not the emotional. The emotions definitely have a place in our life, but when we're doing critical thinking and logic, if somebody's getting at your emotions or they're getting at your affective component, they might be underscoring or bypassing your reasoning faculties, and that's what we want to avoid. So it gives you an example. Communism means that brilliant invention of Karl Marx and other foolish political visionaries in which the national wealth is supposed to be held by the common of the people. So what he's doing is being very sarcastic here, and he's slapping down the word communism, brilliant invention, and other foolish political visionaries. He's making fun of Karl Marx. Okay? That's not an accurate way of describing communism. There's a better way to do it, more precise, fact-based, instead of appealing to your emotions. Theism means a belief in the great Santa Claus in the sky. Really? Theism could mean belief in God. And that could be a more precise definition, right? But when somebody says they appeal to your emotions or affective terminology, that says great Santa Claus in the sky, they're making fun of theism. They're making fun of people who believe in God. We want to avoid that. Rule 8, and this is the last rule, lexical definition should indicate the context to which the definition pertains. And he gives you the example of deuce. Could be used in poker or tennis. You know, there's 2 different contexts. Which context do you mean when you're giving me the definition of that word? And then he gives you another example, strike. Strike could be used in baseball, bowling, or fishing. Now, I actually did not know it could be used in fishing until I looked at this. A pull on a line made by a fish and taking the bait. I didn't know it was a strike. I knew baseball and bowling were. So you want to avoid missing the context. You want to include the context when you're defining a word so that it doesn't violate that rule. So again, you have 8 rules. If a definition avoids violating those rules, makes it into a lexical, or it will count as a lexical definition and make it into a dictionary. Now let's see how we can use these as an example in your homework. Okay, so in your homework, you may be using MindTap online, and that'll be separate from this. This is just going to give you an example, okay? And this is, again, this is in your reading. So in this section, criticize the following definitions in light of the 8 rules of lexical definitions. So we already know they're going to be faulty. We just want to know what rule can we apply to it. Okay, so number 1, a sculpture is a 3-dimensional image made of marble. What one of those rules could you use to criticize that? Think about that for a second. A sculpture is a 3-dimensional image made of marble. Rule 3, it's too narrow. It's not including enough. Can you think of something, can you think of a sculpture being made of something other than marble? Sure. Ice, wood, clay, right? But this just says marble. So you have to, if it's too narrow, you have to do what? You have to include more. You have to broaden it more. Okay? So again, you have to redefine this so that it doesn't violate that rule. Then sculpture can be put into a dictionary. But until you do that, this can't be put into a dictionary. Why? Because it's too narrow. Number 2, illusory means elusive. You think about that, it looks like we're defining in a circle. We're using elusive, which is virtually the same thing as illusory. And what did I tell you before? Well, first off, this is rule 4. It's circular. you have to use independent language to define this, not the same language or virtually the same language, okay? So until you deal with that word and you redefine it, it is violating Rule 4 and it can't be used in a dictionary. Birdie means a sinking ball in one stroke under par. Well, I gave you an example of that in Hurley. That's Rule 8. There's no reference made to the context. Why? Because you could be talking about at least 3 different possible contexts. Let's go down to 5. Semantics is when somebody studies words. Right there, is when seems kind of sloppy. You could say it's Rule 1 in proper grammar. You might also say that it's Rule 2 because it lacks the essential meaning. Why? Because it's not studying words, it's studying word meanings. So if you were to pick between it seems like it's Rule 1 and it seems like it's Rule 2, but which one is the answer, right? Well, is when seems a little sloppy, and he quotes it. Now, Hurley says you have to quote it, but it really seems like, okay, it really seems like if you were to pick, it is Rule 2. It is lacking the essential meaning. Why? Because it's actually false. Semantics is not when somebody studies words. They're studying word meanings. And that's the bottom line behind this entire chapter 2, is we're looking at word meanings, right? And how are we defining these words? So it would be this one. And why do I tease this out? Because some of these answers, you might think it's 2 possible rules, but there's always one that's better. So it's Rule 2, lacking the essential meaning of the word. How about 7? A theist is anyone who is not an atheist or an agnostic. This word not right there stands out. And we could have defined it in the positive, but we chose to define it in the negative. And what rule was that? There you go, Rule 5, negative, correct. So let's do this. Let's do the last one. We'll do 11. Wood means a fibrous, lignified cellulose. Man, that seems really wordy or overly technical. And correct, it is Rule 6. Rule 6 could have been figurative, obscure, vague, or ambiguous. This just happens to be obscure. The meaning is hidden as a result of inappropriate language. What kind? Overly wordy, very technical. You could describe word in another way other than this so that it's clear to the reader what you mean when you're defining. So again, these are just some examples that Hurley uses for you to understand what criteria are used so that a definition is properly included into a dictionary and it can't violate any of these rules. So I hope that helps you a little bit. And again, these mini lectures, are supposed to be supplementary. In other words, I hope you would have done the reading already. This is just in addition to the reading that you've already done. And then I think you'll be put in a position to better answer questions related to the text. Alrighty, enjoy. And if you have any other questions, just reach out to me.